Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, weird history, and we have our author interview special that we love to do from time to time when TK sends out her chaotic messages or emails, and sometimes we get answers from the author, and today we did. I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Angela Stienne. She is an author, obviously, a museum researcher, a historian, and a storyteller. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
I'm so excited that you replied to me because I love to just randomly DM people. And I actually found Dr. Angela from a Google search that I was doing. If you have been a listener of For the Love of History for a while, I'm sure you heard the Egyptian tattoo episode that we did a long time ago, and I just re-released it in the interim between season 8 and season 9. And while I was doing research for that episode, I was having some moral ickiness, some moral conflicts about showing remains of the mummies with the tattoos, and apparently I was not the only one, nor the first one to think about that moral conflict, because I came across Dr. Angela's book, Mummified: The Stories Behind Egyptian Mummies in Museums. And believe it or not, this book on mummies contains no images of mummies. So, first of all, before we dive into your book, I'd love to know about your background. How did you get into mummies, Egyptology, history? Please let us know.
I think I have a very unusual background, but also a very usual one, in that when I was 12, 13, I decided I wanted to be an Egyptologist. And that's the very usual one. I think a lot of us went through this phase. But I think maybe the difference is that I just never gave up on it. So everyone's
Yeah.
like, it's going to pass. And it did not. But I for a bit of context, I grew up in the suburb of Paris. So I think, one of the things is I had a lot of sort of exposure to the world of Egyptology because of, friends' involvement with Egypt, and especially with the history of Egyptology, which is something I'm really interested about. So of course, I grew up, I had the Louvre, but also the obelisk, all of these sites that kind of sort of nurture your interest. But I decided, that very early on that this is what I was going to do, and the shape and form wasn't very defined. It changed a lot, but it's really something that I got really interested in at a very young age, but not really Egyptian mummies as a topic of research. So I wanted to be an Egyptologist, but I didn't even ever imagine that first that I would do all my studies in English and move to England, but also that it would actually be on human remains. And maybe that's a bit reassuring that at 13 I did not want to study human remains, but
Yeah.
it's sort of like is a journey and a development and something that we can sort of go into a bit more. But it's really led me to being a human remains researcher, and especially on ethics related questions.
Yeah, that's incredible. You don't really think about, at least I didn't think about the ethics of Egyptology and the ethics of archaeology in general until I was much older. So, what got you started with ethics, and especially this question of whether it's ethical or not to show images of mummies? How did this journey start?
So for me, what is really important is that word journey. And I think a lot of ethics researcher, the way that we're presented, we look like we're saint. We just always had the ethical approach to things. I don't think it's the case for most people, but it's not for me. And for me, it's been not a journey of learning, but it's very much been a journey of unlearning. So I used to I ran a project called Mummy Stories. That's 7, 8 years old, and at the beginning it was absolutely covered with images of human remains. And for me, it's very important to be transparent about this,
Yeah.
because that's also how I'm good at communicating this. It's because I've been there, done that, done the thinking, and now I'm trying to explain to you what my thinking is in a non-prescriptive way, because we're all on a different journey. I went from being a historian of an ancient historian, not very long, then a historian of Egyptology, then a
Mm,
museum historian and a museum researcher. And my research has been for now 10, 12 years exclusively about Egyptian human remains. And it's been the exposure to the research, but also to those bodies, spending a lot of
mhm,
time in storage rooms, not exclusively with Egyptian human remains, but with other
mhm,
human remains. When I work at the Science Museum, for example, in London, that has, sort of aided my questioning, but also it's the practice of, walking on mummy stories and sharing all of those pictures and having, a laptop and a phone full of
mhm,
photographs and feeling gradually that if I'm explaining and trying to question what people did in the past, trying to understand isn't what we're doing now just a displacement in practice?
mhm, mhm,
And is that right? And then the decision came, a few years ago that I wouldn't share photographs of human remains on the website because there were some human remains that I wouldn't share and some that I would. And I was like, well, where is the value? What are some, people more deserving of respect and so on? And so when it came to doing a book, I thought this is actually an opportunity to
mhm.
question the practice of having the face of a mummy as the cover of a book, which is so common,
Yeah.
especially around some more famous like Ramses or
Mhm,
mummified bodies that are more famous. And so that is what sort of led me to think, well, actually, that's going to be a clause in my book contract. I'm pretty flexible on the book, but there will not be any photographs of human remains to set a precedent. And I think for me, that's also what, being a researcher and sort of a thinker in the field is that we're going to try and do it once, and then hopefully more people will do that.
yeah, that's excellent. Can you remember, was there a moment in time or a particular case that you were studying where you had this maybe aha moment or oh shit moment where you're like,
Mm.
I can't show these, I can't do this, I can't upload these pictures. Was there anything like that or was it more gradual than that?
So for me, a lot of the thinking goes back to the mummified man that's at the Louvre because that is where. So I talk a lot about him in my book, but it's also my first encounter with Egyptian mummies was with a physical, real person, and
Mhm.
that's very different from most people. So I watched the Mummy movie the first time 6 months ago.
Oh,
So
really?
I had literally no exposure to any of maybe Scooby Doo, but it's which is very unusual for the film. So I grew up wanting to be an
Mm.
Egyptologist that has never watched. I've still not watched Indiana Jones. I'm very completely sort of unusual path. That's where my unusual path really is. But my first encounter was very young. So with this man who's been on display since the opening of the Louvre, so 18, 26, 27, and
Mhm.
it means that my encounter with those remains has always been with them as people, and I've always
Mhm.
had this thing when I was younger. I would go and I send the book, I'd go and say hi, and it's a very quiet conversation, but it's always been in that framework. So for me, that has influenced the practice today. And so the more you think about this, the more I think your thoughts progress. For me, the haha moment is social media. It's
Mm.
seeing them on Instagram. It's seeing them being, I think perhaps my moment was when there was this, episode of the reconstructed voice of a mummified person. I don't know if you heard of this story that happened a few years ago that was using sort of, 3D scanning to
Mm.
supposedly reconstruct the voice of a mummy.
Oh my
Obviously,
gosh.
the result was completely unuseful and interesting in my opinion, but also
Mhm.
but it's sometimes it's research, and so it's not so much judging that, but it's the reaction on social media
Mm.
was pretty dreadful. If you think of them as a person, there was a lot of jokes and a lot of memes and a lot of things. And then
Mhm.
whether it was on Twitter at the time or on Instagram, I have started seeing things that just gradually were pushing the boundaries of ethics. And I thought, well, if I share pictures, I'm basically putting them out there to be used that way. And it's
Yeah.
very different than if you show them, for example, in a conference, or which I no longer do, but also can think can be useful for teaching and things like this.
Mhm.
That is very different because you sort of control. the narrative not in a controlling way, but in making sure that it doesn't, get used for something else. And so I realized that that moment, that what I was uploading online could be used for another purpose, which was against what I was trying to do. So it's not being prescriptive. It's not saying this should never be done. It's
Mhm.
saying I'm not going to do it because I don't want my work and the work that other people are doing, because a lot of the pictures, they came from people that send me stories, to
Mhm.
be used for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the wonderful and also terrible things about social media is once you put that out there, it's out and you have no control over how people use it, in what way people use it, and what they say around those images. So I can imagine that being really weird in a way.
But it was also very interesting
Hmm.
because since then, the walk still continues, the
Yeah.
conversation continues,
Hmm.
and it gave me an opportunity or approach to be more creative in the way that I share those stories. And I think sometimes we're like, look at this, very graphic photograph. How do you feel about it? That's not the
Mm-hmm.
only way. That's definitely not the most creative way to elicit emotion in conversations.
Yeah. So let's shift over to your book a little bit and talk about those creative ways. So, can you tell us a little bit of an overview of what your book is about?
Yes, so it's very much a journey of thinking and of learning and unlearning what Egyptian mummies are, as as sort of material bodies, but also
Hmm.
why they're in museums. And it's a journey through time. It's based in France and in England, and it goes through
Hmm.
sort of the very intricate but also very little known, sometimes pretty strange stories about how Egyptian mummified bodies ended up in museums. For
Hmm.
me, the reflection of the book is you go to England, in the middle of England, and you will find a museum that has Egyptian mummies in the most green, wet, cold, sorry, England, weather, landscape, environment. And my thinking is, do you ever stop and look at them and think, why?
Yeah.
How did they end up here? Why are they here? Why am I just having a little stroll, drinking my little coffee, walking in a
Hmm.
museum that's free, and just seeing an Egyptian mummified body and just being like, oh yeah, just another one like every museum, without
Yeah.
questioning how it ended up here? Because if you think about it, is that is what is very strange. Egyptian mummified bodies are not strange. The fact that they exist in that environment is strange, and the fact that we don't question it is interesting to me. And that is very much what the book is about. So it goes through
Hmm.
all these stories about how they were brought from Egypt and all of those disasters and all of these, very strange practices, some very wrong practices. But
Hmm.
all of it is really to lead you to the question of, why are they here today? And why do we go and see them without judgment, but more of a
Hmm.
journey of, I hope people close it and they're like, I have so many questions.
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of questions after closing your book. One of my questions was more of a rhetorical one of why people are okay with going to see the mummified remains of people, but often people are uncomfortable with scary movies or seeing violent video games or something like that. What is that disconnect that makes people not okay with this, but very okay with seeing human remains
Mm.
on display? And in your book, you talk about some of the very strange ways that the mummies came from Egypt to England and France. And can you, I don't want you to spoil your whole book, but can you give us a little bit of insight into how that happened in the first place?
I think what's very interesting is if you look back, they've always been there. They've always
Mhm.
been part of our, popular culture, our history,
Mhm.
our cultural history. And it goes back to such a length and, so far in history that that explains why they're not so accepted. And some of
Mhm.
the way that they go back into our history are so curious. So one of, the probably the most curious, probably the most gruesome, probably the strangest one is how they were part of, medical history.
Yeah.
not for their dissection, but for the actual consumption. So there's this entire history of, mummified bodies being used as like medicine that you would ingest. And that you'd think is a very isolated episode. But when you see people like royals using it, you're like, oh wow, the entanglement with our history is pretty deep. But also, as you say, the disconnect to them being, bodies, like dead bodies that, we should at least just respect, and, like whether we should see them, the
Hmm.
disconnect, it starts very, very much there, because we used to eat them. And
Yeah.
that's just, a sentence I just never get used to saying. But so there is this objectification that goes back very long time. And so,
Mm.
through history, we see this. And I think the disconnect that you mentioned, that we don't go and see them as, dead bodies, that,
Mm.
the way that we could think of other bodies or other representation, it's because it's so deep that we just completely forget. And of course, popular cultures and all of this, but it's easy to blame popular culture and think it's a very recent phenomenon. But
Yeah.
actually no, there's just this very deep, very multi layered history of just using them, appropriating them, having very strange reactions to them, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. How and why did the first person be like, you know what? Let me eat that. Who looks at a
Yeah.
mummy and thinks delicious? So strange. So, do you think some of this disconnect comes with the language that we use when we talk about mummies? For example, we use the word mummy often instead of human remains. Do you think that has something to do with this disconnect?
Yes, it's a lot of the conversation that's happening, recently with
Mhm.
museums, with, researchers in ethics, whether we should completely stop using the word, mummy, and say mummified bodies or mummified
Mhm.
human remains. I think, yes, language is important. I don't think we can suddenly stop using the word mummy
Yeah.
without alienating people and saying, well, what you're doing is wrong. Because for me,
Mm.
the problem is saying to the public, you saying mummy is wrong, we're never going to use it again, without explaining the thinking behind it. And so
Mhm.
that's very much what I wanted to do with Mummified, is just, at the end of it, hopefully your views have changed. It doesn't mean that you will never go and see a mummified body and so on. But I don't think saying you calling it a mummy is wrong makes sense,
Yeah.
because first, people don't know that very long history, but also because it would be very, it wouldn't it be a bit ironic if the museum sectors tell people that the way they say things is wrong, when we've been feeding them those stories about mummies being, attractive, gruesome? We put mummies as the show of museums for a
Mhm.
reason. We want people to get excited about it, to come to the museum, and no saying, well, what you're doing is wrong.
Mhm.
That's not how we're going to change. That's how we're going to get people to no longer trust the sector as well. So what I think is important is however you use it, and also because of course translations in all languages don't necessarily work. It's just putting
Mhm.
the human at the heart of conversation. So if you
Yeah.
want to say mummified person, go for it. But you know what? That's not going to really sell on an exhibition. Come see a mummified person. The question is, have conversation with people. Why do you have an
Mm.
exhibition about? Because if you have an exhibition about a mummy, or if you have an exhibition about a mummified person, you're still putting a body on show.
Yeah.
That is where the conversation should be. I'm
Mhm.
very keen on rehumanizing,
Mm.
the conversations, the display, the thinking around mummies. I don't think that, that is the only way to do it. The way we display them is
Mhm.
often dehumanizing, and changing one word is not going to change that. We need to change our mindset.
Yeah, I agree. And I think your book is really helping to change that mindset in a really gentle and non judgmental and, like you were saying, non prescriptive way. And I think that's the thing that really resonated for me with the book, is that it never felt like a lecture. It never felt like you were saying, you are a bad person for going and looking at these mummies and you need to change right this very moment. I think it was a very gentle and informative way to start this conversation about repersoning mummified remains or mummies. Or
Mm.
however you choose to say. So, you in your book, you talk about the white mummy returns. And that is something that is really on my mind recently, is the repatriation of certain artifacts, certain mummies, certain things. So, could you tell us a little bit more about that chapter, The White Mummy Returns?
Yes, so it's a chapter that I really wanted to write and was really
Mhm.
hesitant to write because of how polarized the conversations
Mm.
are,
Mhm.
today around topics around colonialism, around,
Yeah.
race studies.
Mhm.
But at the same time, the reason that for me it was really important to talk about this is because in the museum sector,
Mhm.
Egyptian mummified bodies are considered the least controversial human remains. Everyone likes mummies, is
Mhm.
what you hear often. And there are a lot of human remains where there is almost no doubt that something wrong happened, that they're here because something wrong happened, right?
Yeah.
but but in Egyptology there's always been this sort of, no, it's fine, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of narratives that are very problematic, and especially, emanating from the two countries that, I lived in, which are, France, and then I lived in England for all my research. So, and
Mhm.
I just felt that if I want people to understand that there is something that we need to talk about, then we need to talk about the race studies in the past. So that's the first chapter on this, which is, very much the scientific or pseudo-scientific research that were
Mhm.
done to try to prove or to manipulate the racial origin of the ancient Egyptians in the context of, colonialism or of empire. And that was very important because I was shocked when I found those, especially the studies done in the Natural History Museum in Paris, which I had never
Mhm.
heard of. So those were, as a historian, I felt that was, my duty to talk about this. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I thought if I stop there, it looks like all the bad things happen in the past.
Yeah.
And it's not the case, and it's not
Mhm.
saying the same things are happening, but for me everything is looking at displacement of practice.
Mm.
Today conversations like conversations around the aliens building the pyramids and things like this, they can be
Yeah.
very humorous, or they
Yeah.
can be what they really are, which is
Yeah.
very problematic conversations about denying the potential, the capacity, the ability, the
Mm.
knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, because people today still struggle with thinking that they're not superior to everything and everyone. And
Yes.
for me, that is what, the white mummy returns is about. It's very much saying, well, those conversations that are complicated and that have sort of that place Egyptology at the center of other conversations, that is not just a little field but actually has an impact on the narratives, they still matter today. The way we frame Egypt today in museums, the way we locate it separately from the continent where it is, and so on, it has an impact. It frames, museums were created for this, to frame the world. And so
Mhm.
that's what it's about. It's talking about the fact that, when we do DNA studies today, they're not neutral, and we have to be aware of that. And sometimes the way that they're communicated, the intention's not wrong, but we have to keep in mind that we exist, researchers, and sometimes we forget, in the global world, and so the conversations that we have, they have an impact. But also because ancient Egypt today
Mhm.
still has such a hold on people and how they
Yeah.
understand the world. And it's quite curious, but we still very much want to understand ancient Egypt to understand the world. And, the pyramids still have such a hold because people want to know, and the reasons they want to know who created them, who built them, how they were built, often they're not neutral. What they
Mhm.
want is they want the answers that benefits them, and that was the case in the past. I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying that a lot of
Mhm.
people also, because for me, a lot of people that do the, alien jokes, they don't
Yeah.
understand the actual, the historical background. They think, when I explain that, they're like, oh god, I've been making this joke, and now I feel,
Mhm.
pretty terrible that I didn't realize. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. It's a tricky chapter, and I
Mm.
don't have an answer to, especially in this chapter,
Yeah.
but I think it's a conversation to put out there. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of other people that are doing similar conversations. And so for me, it's an invitation to go and think about it more.
Yeah, I think that you navigated that really well and very delicately. And I'm a big fan of that chapter because it was very thought provoking. And for me as well, I very, very much dislike, and I hesitate to use the word hate, but I kind of hate it when people make these jokes about the ancient aliens building pyramids. And I have found that recently on especially TikTok, TikTok is a place where pseudoscience and conspiracy historians and archaeologists find themselves large audiences. And there's even lots of documentaries, again, hesitate to use that word, that
Mm.
have come out recently that are not based in reality. They're based in conspiracy and pseudoscience. So I think having your book is a really great glass of cold water, a very refreshing
Mhm.
thing to read in the face of so much misinformation. So you were talking earlier about the kind of uncomfortable ways that the mummies came to Paris and England. And is there one story in particular that you don't mind sharing?
I think it's not, for me, the most interesting, revealing, and comfortable stories are not the ones about the ones that arrived. So, first, we
Mhm.
have very little, traceability on a lot of them.
Yeah.
It's the stories of the ones that were brought by boat, which is, of course, the most usual, the way that we would
Mhm.
transport them from Egypt. It's all the stories of the ones that did not make it that for me are so revealing. So there's
Yeah.
this chapter where I just like feel like it's an endless list of absolute disaster at sea, but it's so interesting where people would bring mummified bodies in the most sort of random way. They'd go to Egypt, they're like adventurers, they're diplomats, and they're like,
Mhm.
I'm gonna bring a mummy because that is how you come back and look cool. It's terrible, but that's just that's the way. So they would
Mhm.
do that, and then they would have no idea how to transport them. They would just put them in like a box that's not the coffin, because they would sell the coffin separately, to make money. So that's why most of the Egyptian mummified bodies in museums today, the coffin you see on display, probably not theirs.
Yeah.
But it's also like the people that are like the sailors that are like, well, actually, I did not sign up to have a dead body on my boat. And there's a lot of sort of anxiety around there, a lot of superstitions around around just having dead bodies
Mhm.
on board of a boat. So there's all these moments where they literally throw them out the boat and they just throw them at sea,
Oh my
because the sailors are like, it's you or the of the mummy. So of course they just, or sometimes they're like, well, you're not, you can't have an entire body, so they chop the head off and just throw the head off and then just bring the rest. And it's just this moment where you're like, I think because we try to rationalize the fact that so many bodies were brought, and they're like, well, it's for studies. For no, most of the Egyptian mummified bodies, and I'm not talking about artifacts, I'm talking about bodies, they were
God.
brought by people who just wanted to be like, and here is what I brought back from holidays, without much thinking.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, there's a lot of incidents about mummified bodies decaying once they arrive in Europe. There's all those incidents of them being, and for me, the ones that don't make it, they're the almost the most important stories,
Mm.
because then it really makes this whole process seem just completely ridiculous. Like, you actually dig bodies out of graves. Obviously different people did that,
Yeah.
but you stop the afterlife, and the wish and the prosperity and the serenity of someone, to
Mhm.
just take it in your suitcase, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, I'd rather make the trip than the mummy, and you just throw it off the boat.
Oh my gosh.
And that really, for me, is just the absurdity sometimes. And
Yeah.
what we see when we see human remains in museum is such a small proportion, that so many decades, so many were just lost, so many, and it's just this transactional way
Mm.
to deal with the body of someone from another culture, from another time. For me, those are the interesting stories, because
Yeah.
it just makes every conversation that we have on how to be ethical in
Mm.
museums with human remains almost ridiculous. Like, it's already too late. We've done so much.
Yeah.
that, well, now we're like, well, with the ones that we have left, what do we do? But so much of the stories behind the scene in the past, even in storages, mummified bodies lying on the floor and stuff like this, it
Mhm.
really puts into context the sort of the strangeness of
Yeah.
this practice.
Yeah, I think I can't remember what chapter it was, but when you describe a room that you went into that just had a bunch of different human remain parts just everywhere, just all over the place. I
Yeah, the Science Museum in London, yes.
Yes, yes, the Science Museum in London. I put the book down. I was like, "Whoa, hold on. This is
Hmm.
real. This is a real thing." And it made me like so sad. I was so sad when I read that part. Of course, I had to continue reading, but what was that moment like for you? I read your thoughts in the book, but I would love to know what your
Mm.
thoughts are now after, it's been almost 2 years since you've finished the book. What are those feelings just as raw as they were then?
I think for me, so this was my postdoctoral research here in
Mhm.
London, and that was very much a shift because my doctoral thesis wasn't so much about ethics, it was very historical. So it was very
Mhm.
much understanding what we've just talked about, the
Mhm.
processes, the thinking, the intellectual ideas, it's and a lot of very, sort of archive heavy research for my
Mhm.
doctoral thesis. Then I moved to, the Science Museum, and for a year, it's about public engagement, but it's
Mhm.
also a lot more sort of, real in a physical sense, where for a couple months I go to the storage of a collection that's actually, from Henry Wellcome. So just the absolute, craziest mass
Yeah.
collector that just collected everything, and but also had, very sort of disturbing, complicated,
Mhm.
thinking around, extra European bodies. And so I walk into this room, and it's very small, and I've obviously seen human remains before. I've interned at the Louvre, so I've also, seen them with storage, but only Egyptian mummified bodies. And so you have
Mm.
this very clinical room, as I call it in the book,
Mm.
because it's very well done. It's very, everything's covered up. There's, it's very respectful, so that if, someone comes and changes a light bulb, they do not have to, see human remains. It's and
Mm.
which is very obviously very important.
Mhm.
And I sit here, and so I open all the cases, and so some all of a sudden everything's very visible, and I just
Mm.
sit here, and it's, people think that our work and our research is very exciting, it's very thrilling, it's very movie
Mm.
like, but actually, you're like wearing gloves, and the smell of just products for,
Mm.
conservation, but also the
Mm.
use of arsenic at the time and things like this. And you sit here and you look around, and you're like, there's 1,000, human remains, and all I could
Mm.
think is, what the hell, like, how did we
Right?
end up with being in a situation where, there's like heads on shelves, there's, and you just look around, and you're like, it's like when we say that the museum is, sort of a micro world, that it
Mhm.
represents the world. In that moment, you sit in a room, and you're like, this is what that means.
Yeah.
But it's not the world, it's the history you don't want to know. You want
Yeah.
to not think about, because you're like, well, I'm sitting and I'm literally seeing the world because human remains in that room come from all around the world. But I'm
Mm.
also seeing, all of these very complicated, very disturbing
Mm.
chapters of history that are also in this room. And I'm like, well, this is like a little bubble of the world, but of the world we don't want to talk about, and it's
Right. Yeah.
it's very interesting. And I think in those moments, this is why I'm so particular about doing more conversations around emotions. Because
Mm.
if that does not make you feel anything, I don't think you should be in that field, because if you sit in that room and you're like, well, yeah, it's just the past, people used to do that, then
Mhm.
then that's how we cannot emotionally engage with people around these questions.
Yeah.
Because I'm very used to engaging with human remains. So, when people ask, are you afraid of not, or, of seeing them? No, I'm afraid of the history that I'm
Yeah.
seeing. It's just, I'm like, I'm not terrified of those bodies. I'm
Mm.
sorry that I'm
Mm.
opening those cases, and I'm
Mm.
sitting here. I wasn't even 30 at the time, and I'm like, why do I have access to all of you when,
Yeah.
you should not be here? I'm in London and I'm just, doing my little, postdoctorate, research. And I'm like, this scenario
Mm,
is just, should it really be a thing? Should I be sitting here? And it's
yeah.
just, it's very emotional. You find if you're not emotional, I think you just get submerged by the things that you're seeing. But it's very interesting, especially when you think that most of it, maybe not all of it at the same museums, but most of this room is one man that had massive wealth and that just went on, this crazy collecting mania.
Wow. That I completely agree with you that it's so important to bring back the emotion into history and archaeology. I think for so long things have been very clinical, been very cut off from emotion, which is important when you are doing research and other things to take our emotions out of it. But I think for a long time, emotions have been taken too much out of things and
Mm,
things have become too clinical to where we can't understand that, yeah, these people lived 5,000, 4,000 years ago, but they were also people. They were also human beings.
mm.
So I couldn't agree with you more. So let's shift a little bit so we're not so doom and gloom this whole time because I I don't want to steer people away from reading your book. So, how did you tackle not having images of remains? Your book has pictures, very lovely pictures. So, what kind of pictures did you put in? How did you navigate that whole no remains in the book?
So for me, it's a questions that I've had for Mummy Stories. What do
Hmm.
I do? Because now I have a website that's just going to be black and white text.
Yeah, right.
It's a question that I've had for Mummified. And then I'm working on a new book now, and
Hmm.
it's going to be a mostly picture book, so like a coffee table book. So a
So
very
fun.
visual book.
Yeah.
And the same thing will apply. And the number of photographs is going to be just so much more. I can't give
Mm.
a lot of details, but it's and now the challenge is even greater because
Yeah.
if the idea is it's visual, for Mummified, there's about 30 photographs. They're
Mm.
black and white. I think for me, it's been really interesting because at the end of the day, mummified bodies in museums, they don't exist on their own. So
Mm.
there's all these objects, all these spaces that they inhabit, the museum and so on. But there's also all of these historical photographs or like posters for exhibitions and things that
Hmm.
actually, if you go and write a book about mummies, you're just going to put 30 pictures of mummies because that's it, job done. But you actually don't really put them in context, right? If you
Yeah.
remove that, I'm like, well, actually, there is this coffin, and the coffin is part of, the body, and it's part of the journey and so on.
Hmm.
That no, it's gorgeous, and no one actually shares. And then there is this museum space, or there's this historical, engraving of. I absolutely adore those of like, people going to the British Museum to see the mummy room, or like the
Hmm.
first ever engraving of the Louvre mummy room, which has been very little published. Because if you're going to write about Egyptian mummies at the Louvre, just put a photograph of Pasheri, right, the mummified man.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then all of a sudden you're going to go in the archive and be like, oh God, that's where they were displayed before. That's really interesting. Or like there's, those paintings of, people first painting at the Louvre and so on. So actually, it just makes it a lot more creative, but it's also a very interesting way of putting those bodies into context. So I
Mhm.
mentioned it a few times in the book, but like there's this Egyptian mummy that's on display in one room, and then it changes, it goes upstairs, and then it goes downstairs, and every time it changes location, the narrative changes. And the narrative changes, but the body doesn't. So it does mean that the
Mm.
space it's in, it affects it. So there's this one in England where it was near like an actual water pound in a museum, in the basement. It was like sort of
Bad
recreating an
idea.
ancient Egyptian garden. But you can see how that environment would impact the way that it's displayed in the story that is told. Because all of a sudden, it's like, imagine you're in the afterlife and this is their dream garden. If
Yeah.
you put it on a display in like a room with lots of like other artifacts from other culture, the story
Mhm.
is going to be different. So if you don't actually focus on the photograph of the body, You have all of
Mhm.
these great stories. And I mean, Egyptian mummies in museums, it's also the history of museums. It's not just the history of Egyptology, it's the
Yeah.
history of people coming to museum. You look at the engraving from the British Museum, you can definitely see that it's people from the upper class. It tells you something about access to museums, who used to go. It's interesting to see, those very elegantly, richly dressed women sort of peeking at a
Mhm.
mummified body and thinking, how did that go? What did they
Yeah.
think at that time?
Yeah.
Was, a lady seeing a dead body, or was it really already, the disconnect was already there? Because I
Yeah.
would assume that so all of these stories, you actually think about them if you don't put those photographs.
Yes, I couldn't have said it better myself. And I loved the pictures that you put in of other people looking at mummies. I think there's
Hmm.
one cartoon of a man who he's got his tiny little glasses and he's
Yeah.
looking at a mummy in a case. And I love that because it
Yeah,
gives.
it's fantastic. This is definitely going in the second book, because it's a bit of like a caricature, but it's so
Mhm.
interesting because it's not recent, and at the same time it feels like a very, almost, you look at it and you're like, oh god, that's what I used to do in museum. And it's kind of
Right.
like it's staring at you, and it's kind of judging you in the way that those sort of, like, kind of cynical caricature were like, this is you. And
Yes.
it's fantastic. I really like it because I'm like, well, instead of putting a photograph and you look at the photograph, no, there's a man doing what you were about to do if you looked at the photograph. So yeah, it's a great one.
Exactly. I feel like it's like a little joke in the midst of trying to navigate these ethical and moral questions. You're like, oh, this guy is doing the thing that I would be doing right now. And
Yeah.
I love it. I love those. And I think that it really does show another level of creativity and historiography of looking at not only the history of these mummies, but the history of the museums that the mummies were in. So I just love it. I cannot sing the praises of your book enough. It was so great. And at the risk of just revealing everything in the book, I want people to still go read your book. Is there any final message that you'd like to tell the listeners? Any final thing that you'd like to say to wrap up our interview today?
I think that because I'm desperately optimist about everything, I think that what I want people to realize is that Egyptian mummies are very important, and they're
Mm,
also not very important. In the global scheme of things today, you're like, okay, why would I read about Egyptian mummies? Why would I care? Why would
mhm,
you spend your entire life, studying this topic? Are there not more, pressing issues?
mhm,
But if we look at Egyptian mummified bodies differently, if
mm,
we look at them at a topic that we are so used to not questioning,
mhm,
we don't question Egyptian mummies. They're everywhere. They've always been there. They're fine. They don't have call for repatriations the way other,
mm,
human remains have, or on the same level. It's fine. But then if you start digging and you're like, oh, I never thought about this. I never questioned this. I never asked questions. Yes, actually, I've been going since I was a kid. Never even, thought of them as like, dead people. Like,
yeah,
kind of, but yeah, did not really think about it.
mm,
Yes, I take my kids and I'm just like, it's a fun thing to do. Once you start questioning this, I'm not saying you start thinking it's wrong. Just you ask
mhm,
questions. Why do I do this? Why did people bring them? Should we really do this? Should we think about it differently?
mm,
On a topic that is so familiar, then you will start thinking and
yeah,
asking questions about other topics, about museum topics, but about, society, the things that we do without thinking, the things that we're like, it's always been like that. I've
mm,
always done that.
mm,
Then it has a rippling effect. And
yeah,
for me, what I want is people to ask more questions
yeah,
about anything they want, just to be
mhm,
curious, to question their practice and their habits, and just, to have these conversations that are more emotional than human. You
mm,
have them about Egyptian mummified bodies, great. But if you have them about a completely different topic, if you never open that book again, but you're like, actually, in which other field, in which other topic, in which other areas of my life can I think a little differently? Can I ask a little more questions? Can I be a little more emotional?
Yeah.
I really think that this is going to have, an impact on our film, but also on us as people. I know because, as I said, I wasn't doing this before, even
Yeah.
though I had been in this field. But it has changed the way that I think about things. But it also has changed the way that I work on other projects that are unrelated. Just because now I'm like, what if we turn things upside down? What if
Mm,
we look at a different angle? For me, that's what's really important. And I think Egypt and mummies being two topics that are so universal
yeah.
somehow. Like you and I right now are on completely opposite side of the world,
Yeah.
and we're having this conversation. If we take those two topics that everyone's so interested about
Mm,
and we just look at them differently, I think we can make great changes.
yeah.
That's what I want, people to do. So, read it and then just apply it to something else.
I
Whether you
love
go to see mummified bodies in museums or not after that, as long as you've done these little shifts, as long as you close it and you're like, oh great, I wanted answer, and now I have so many more questions,
it.
then my job's done. That's what I want to do, tell stories and make people think.
I love it. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Angela. I really, really appreciate you coming on, sharing your story, creating this absolutely excellent book. I can't thank you enough for your time. So, is there any final thing that you'd like to plug? Where can people find you? Is there any other books that you're working on or things that you'd like to promote? Now is your time. The stage is yours.
I think the only thing is that, the support has been so lovely from you and from so many people that the only thing I'll share is that it's going to come in paperback next year, which is very nice to continue the conversations. And I'm working on another one, but for this one, you have to brush up on your French because it's actually coming up in French next year. But there will be lots of pictures. But other than that, the only thing I'd say is just, really just keep supporting writers and authors because it's been a wonderful journey and it's also a lot more complex than a lot of people think. So things like, what you do is just wonderful. So thank you so much for your
Oh,
work as well.
thank you so much. That's so kind of you. So I will put all of the links to Dr. Angela's website, where to get the book, and her social medias, all of that fun stuff in the show notes below so that you can continue to help support her by getting the book or requesting it at your library. So thank you so much,
Yes.
and I will see you in the outro. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, dear one, thank you so much for joining Dr. Angela and I for this wonderful episode talking about her book. Who knew a book on mummies could be so interesting without any pictures of mummies? And I'm about to say something controversial yet brave. Even more interesting than your run-of-the-mill mummy book, I think. But that's just me. That is just me. If you enjoyed this episode and you would like to support Dr. Angela, you can head down to the show notes to find all of the places where you can buy her book. And if you like to support things in which we're talking about right now, you can. God, that was probably the worst segue I've ever done. Anyways, if you like support and you want to support this podcast, you can head down to the show notes as well for all sorts of ways to support For the Love of History. You could get some amazing merch. It's very cute and very comfy. You could join us over on Patreon for lots of bonus content, for early access to episodes, for so many fun things over there. You can also donate to the For the Love of History app, which we are still holding donations for. If you haven't heard about that, you can head on over to the website where I tell you all about it, what it is, why we're doing it. And if you haven't already, one of the best free 99 ways to support For the Love of History is to leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, because that's the only way Apple Podcasts is going to know that you think this is a good podcast and other people should know about it. And another free 99 way is by subscribing over on YouTube. And you can see my lovely face and the lovely face of all my guests and the not so lovely faces of the people that we talk about the garbage humans to be particular, and the very lovely faces of the Empress Baddies and all of the various other things that we talk about. I'm rambling. I'm a little bit tired, so I'm going to go and drink some water, maybe a coffee, and I'll see you next week when we talk about the deadly history of tea. And boy, howdy, let me tell you, friend, the bibliography on this one is long, so strap in. All right, do something for yourself to make you happy. Go outside, touch your grass, drink some water, and I will see you next week. Okay, love you so much. Bye.